Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. So why am I talking about this movie today? Fair question. Well, to make a long story short, I recently watched the Naked Gun remake for the first time, starring Liam Neeson. Didn't really care for it, but that might be a video for another time. But there was one scene in that movie that made me laugh quite a bit, and it's this ridiculous montage scene where Liam Neeson and Pam Anderson are going to this winter cabin for a romantic getaway. They end up making a snowman, and then they end up using black magic to make the snowman come to life. And then the snowman ends up going crazy and trying to kill them. During that scene, it establishes in that little montage that Liam Neeson uses an inhaler for some reason. And then we see the snowman emptying out the inhaler, to which I was watching this movie with my mom. She was laughing hysterically. And she's like, they're making fun of that, what's that one 90s movie? The Good Son! With Macaulay Culkin. I was like, oh, I've heard of that movie. I've never seen it before. She's like, no, wait a minute. I'm mixing up the movie. What is it? And she ended up looking it up. She's like, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. That's what they're making fun of. I was like, oh, I've never heard of that movie. And then when I looked it up, I kind of fell down this rabbit hole of all of these 90s, what have been labeled as these 90s yuppie thrillers that were super popular during the early to mid 90s with movies like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Pacific Heights, the Michael Keaton movie, which I actually watched before I watched The Hand That Rocks the Cradle because it was on Tubi. And then other movies like I haven't seen before, like Unlawful Entry and Single White Female. I mean, these movies were hugely popular and quite successful when they came out. And then these type of films, or the blueprint for these type of stories, would eventually become like these cheesy Lifetime movies for stay-at-home wine moms, is basically where the genre ended up. But I'm not super familiar with a lot of these movies, and that's why it kind of piqued my interest. And the other reason why I wanted to watch this movie is because it was directed by Curtis Hanson, a filmmaker that I'm not super familiar with, but he did make one of my all-time favorite movies, LA Confidential. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And I was like, maybe this movie will be like a little bit better than I expect it to be, because I expect it to be kind of a cheesy, yuppie, generic type of thriller, which I was correct about, unfortunately. I don't think this is a really good movie, and I'll get into the specifics as to why, but I do think it's kind of an interesting movie to talk about, especially when you consider that this movie is about to be remade, which I did not find out until after I watched the movie. I found out while I was doing prep for this video, actually, that this movie is being remade. It's going straight to streaming, which, you know, seems appropriate for this type of movie. It's going to be on Hulu, and it's coming out next month. So now I'm going to have to end up watching the remake, because I already watched the original movie, and just see what the differences are. I do think that this movie could potentially benefit from a remake. That might be an unpopular opinion, because there's a lot of people that really like this movie, look back on it fondly. I have a lot of issues with it, which I'll get into, but before I get into the specifics of that, let's do a brief overview of the plot. So like a lot of these thrillers, the movie focuses on what seems like to be the perfect American family that lives in the Pacific Northwest, in an area that I actually grew up outside of, which is kind of another reason why I wanted to watch the movie. But it focuses on the Bartell family. There's Claire, there's her husband Michael, there's their daughter Emma, and they have a brand new baby boy that they just brought into the world. And we see them moving in and kind of redecorating, doing stuff to their house, and that's where we get introduced to the character of Solomon, played by Ernie Hudson. And talk about a character that would not fly today in most movies, and probably for the best, because his character is horribly dated and kind of offensive in the way he operates in this movie. I'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later. But that's the setup of our core characters that we're meant to sympathize with. Claire goes back to the hospital to get a checkup from the gynecologist, and her doctor ends up sexually molesting her, which sends her into an asthma attack, which is a very important part of her character, which we'll talk about later. She ends up blowing the whistle on this terrible doctor who sexually molests his patients, and he does it through being a doctor and a gynecologist and all this stuff. And the guilt of this results in the doctor committing suicide. And he's married to Rebecca De Mornay, which we'll know as Peyton later in the movie, who is pregnant with their child, but she ends up miscarrying after the fallout and the trauma of her husband committing suicide. And as she's recovering in the hospital, she sees the news story on TV, sees Claire's face, and concocts this whole plan of becoming this nanny to go into her family and basically try to steal her family away from her. That's the plot of this movie. A totally ridiculous, kind of stupid plot. But this is early on in the movie, and I was like, okay, I'm still interested to see where this is going to go, despite the fact that the plot of this movie is incredibly dumb. I was waiting for the movie to kind of subvert my expectations of like, oh, maybe this doesn't feel as dumb as I think it may be, but it doesn't really. And partly because like this movie really suffers from some really dumb character stuff, some really big missed opportunities that I thought would have enhanced the movie in terms of being more entertaining and more thrilling. For example, the way Claire meets Peyton, just kind of meets her randomly on the street, and, you know, doesn't know anything about this woman, has no references, has no background information on her whatsoever, but still invites her into the house, talks about, you know, being a nanny, and there's that scene where, you know, she's checking on the baby, her earring falls out, we see Peyton pick up the earring, and as everybody leaves the room, she pretends that the baby was choking on it, and was like, oh, you know, I found this in the baby's mouth. That obviously I'd be a great nanny. And they're like, oh, let's hire this person who we don't know. So right off the bat, it's like the movie doesn't do a really good job of making this all that believable. And I know a lot of these movies get pretty far-fetched, but like to make a comparison, which I'm going to compare this movie to a lot of other better thrillers, in my opinion. For example, Fatal Attraction, which fucking rules. Fatal Attraction gets pretty hammy and ridiculous in like the last act, but the setup of that movie and the drama that movie creates is like, feels like it could be plausible. Like a guy sleeping with a woman that ends up turning out completely crazy and tries to ruin his life. Like, that's happened in reality. That's, and the way the character reacts to it and he tries to handle the situation feels plausible and realistic. This movie doesn't even attempt that by comparison. So at this point in the movie, we're seeing Peyton doing all these little psychological messed up things to try to ruin the family, such as breastfeeding the baby to cause nipple confusion with the mother and all that stuff, which that's the thing that really freaked out my mom about this movie. I wasn't born yet, but she obviously wanted to have a kid, and so that part of the movie really stuck with her as being super messed up. I think that's what this movie's aiming for. It's aiming for kind of the mom audience, because that's where most of the fear lies, is in that psychological aspect of it. She's also getting some alone time with Emma, trying to psychologically manipulate her and saying that, oh, you know, you can tell me stuff that you can't tell your parents, and doing all this little stuff. There's a funny scene early in the movie where Emma talks about this bully she's dealing with, and we see Peyton confront the bully, cussing at the bully, twisting his arm, doing all this crazy shit. And then Peyton finds out information about the family that she can use to her benefit. Like, she learns about how Michael and Julianne Moore, which, you know, I love Julianne Moore. She's kind of great in everything. But in this movie, her primary purpose, which I thought was hilarious, is to constantly remind the audience how stupid Claire is for letting this really attractive looking woman who she doesn't know anything about into the house, letting her around her children and stuff like that. That's kind of her only real purpose in this movie, which is, you know, it's a waste of a great actress.
You never, ever let an attractive woman take a power position in your home.
But she finds out about that, and she uses that later on in the movie, trying to convince Claire that Michael's having some sort of an affair with Julianne Moore because they had a past relationship, but now they're just friends. Finds out about Claire having asthma, that is the best part of the movie, and I'll get into that in a minute. And then there's another big turning point in the movie where Peyton meets Solomon, the mentally disabled individual who is helping building a fence around the house, played by Ernie Hudson. And that's was a big turning point in the movie for me, where I'm like, this feels like not cool by today's standards. I'm sorry. It's a very poorly executed character that is only meant to emotionally manipulate the audience. Of course, any decent person would feel bad for a character like Solomon, but the way that's portrayed in this movie made me feel uncomfortable, and it just felt cheap in a way that was off-putting. Because Solomon ends up seeing that she's the nanny's breastfeeding Claire's baby, and then of course there's that really famous scene in the movie where she confronts Solomon, is threatening him and calling him, you know, the R word and all of this stuff, and then ends up framing Solomon as if he's molesting Emma. And I just felt that was a bit redundant. It didn't feel that necessary because we had all these other moving pieces in the movie to demonstrate how evil Peyton was and how far she would go to try to manipulate this family and try to remove Claire from the picture. We didn't need that. We didn't need a character like Solomon. I mean, obviously it was the 90s, so it was fine then. I seriously doubt that the remake is going to bring that character back. We'll see. I like Ernie Hudson. I think he's a great actor, and I think he does fine in the movie given what type of character he's playing. But I was not cool with the cheap emotional manipulation that felt so heavy-handed, so obvious, and just really lazy. Outside of the fact that it's just kind of flat out offensive. So at this point in the movie, we're about halfway into it, and I'm getting kind of bored. because the movie's nearly 2 hours long. I think minus credits, it's like an hour 50. All of the characters, every single one of them, are generic stereotypes. So they're not particularly interesting. There's not a, outside of the fact that they're a normal everyday family and this shouldn't be happening to them, there's not a lot to sympathize with outside of that. But then the movie starts to kind of pick up steam in the later half. There's one big moment where Peyton is messing up the marriage between Michael and Claire, like, her ripping up an important letter that Claire has to deliver on Michael's behalf. But here's the thing. Peyton keeps doing all these little things to try to like ruin their marriage, and it never works. The big example of this is the scene where Peyton is suggesting to Michael to throw a surprise party for her with all of their closest friends and stuff like that. And she's also trying to convince Claire that Michael is having an affair with Julianne Moore. And this all culminates into the surprise party scene, which I laughed out loud because it was just kind of comedic. You're cheating on me, you son of a bitch. And he's just like, Claire, everybody we know is in the other room. And so that's like a big, crazy, dramatic moment that could jeopardize their marriage. But then in the next scene, they reconcile immediately. And that's the thing. There's no threat to their marriage because like they just come back together no matter what. And it's like, I found it weird that the movie was doing that because you're missing out on a lot of dramatic possibilities. I was thinking of the movie Cape Fear, which I think maybe you could argue that Cape Fear could fall into the yuppie thriller category, but it's directed by Martin Scorsese, so it's better than all of those movies. And I rewatched Cape Fear last year, so it's still fresh in my mind. That movie really holds up in terms of being genuinely unsettling and upsetting while also having a fun, goofy, campy atmosphere. The way it's able to balance those two tones is genuinely impressive to me. But one of the things about Cape Fear that makes it so upsetting is the fact that we see how Max Cady is manipulating this family, and this family's being ripped apart, and Jessica Lange like outright like hates Nick Nolte, and like you finding out about his external affairs and all this stuff, and they're already having problems with their marriage, and it's just like that drama needed to be in this movie. I needed to see more moments of like Claire and Michael really going at it or them being really driven apart because it doesn't really happen. And that's the big moment. Like I said, there's the big surprise party scene, which by the way, if Claire thinks that Michael's cheating just because she's having a surprise party and everybody's in the next room, that doesn't change anything. Her suspicions should still be there because they haven't been rightly answered for by Michael. But the movie kind of just abandons it completely and like, oh, I'm sorry, I feel so embarrassed. I can't even talk to Julianne Moore. I forget her character's name. I can't even talk to her. I'm so embarrassed. It's like, that doesn't change like the suspicions that you had that feel legitimate, but the movie just abandons it anyway. And then there's the big scene where Julianne Moore finds out the truth about Peyton and goes over there by herself, unarmed, with no plan whatsoever, to confront her. And then she ends up going to the greenhouse where we saw Peyton sabotaging it so that when the roofs fall, like a bunch of glass falls on top of her, which by the way, that's not a surefire way to kill somebody. In fact, I think most of the time you could probably survive something like that. But whatever, I'm getting nitpicky. It's fine for this type of movie. But that goes into the best scene, like the scene that actually worked for me in terms of creating genuine suspense. Claire sees the dead body. She has an asthma attack, and then she's looking for her inhaler, but as we saw prior to that scene, Peyton was emptying out all the inhalers, which is why I watched this movie to begin with, was because of that scene in The Naked Gun. But that actress and the way she is reacting to having an asthma attack feels very real, and there's that really eerie scene where she just collapses on the front porch, and the camera's holding on her face sideways, completely silent. She looks like she's not breathing. Her face is pale white. That was like the one moment that stood out to me, because the rest of this movie in terms of direction and editing and any sort of style is very bland. Like I said, Cape Fear, for example, Martin Scorsese injects some of that cinematic flair into that movie to make it stand out, to make it memorable. I think this movie could have benefited from that. And then we get to the climax of the movie where Claire finds out for herself about Peyton's true identity and how she's clearly manipulating the family. She confronts her by punching her right in the face. And that's another moment where it's like, there could have been a great dramatic moment there where the husband's like, well, wait a minute, Claire, how do you know? Like, what evidence do you have? How do you know that Peyton's doing this? There could have been more of that marriage crumbling dynamic that this movie doesn't really have. But instead, he immediately just believes her. You get out of my house, you crazy bitch. I'm paraphrasing, but he probably should have said that. And then, of course, that goes into the classic where all of these thrillers end up, where it turns into kind of a hokey slasher-esque movie where she hits the husband in the face with the shovel. He falls funny. I laughed when I saw that. She tries to steal the kids away, but the kids... The Emma's already like, nope, you're crazy, and so I'm going to hide my little brother. And then Solomon comes back into the movie to get his redemption arc, to prove that, you know, he's not a monster and he was framed by Peyton and all this stuff. And then Claire fakes having an asthma attack to get the advantage on Peyton, to which I was really hoping for a great villain monologue, which this movie doesn't have that either. There should have been a scene where Peyton was like, you're the reason why my husband died. You've made up those horrible lies about him. Like there was no, I wish this movie went more into Peyton's character about how she would like, make up her own story about her husband, how she completely denies all of the facts about him being a rapist, and just showing that side of her. The movie doesn't do that. And instead she's like, when your husband closes his eyes and makes love with you, it's my face he's picturing, which that's not true, because she came on to him earlier in the movie, in the scene where Michael tries to go see the dead body of his previous relationship, which, by the way, once again, like I said, this movie will set up a dramatic moment, and then the next scene, everything's fine. Because after that scene, in the scene where Peyton is trying to seduce him, and he's like, he turns her down, like, outright. He's like, there's only one woman for me. Then in the next scene, they're like playing Go Fish. It's like, dude, none of the characters behave like real people in this movie, and that would have, like, I don't know, made the movie feel more tense than it was, in my opinion. So then we get the great heroic ending where Claire pushes Peyton out the window and she's impaled on the fence that Solomon was building. You know, some poetic justice, some ironic death there. And then the movie ends with the cops showing up, and, you know, Solomon is back in the good graces of the family and everything's fine, more or less. So that's The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. A movie that reminded me of a lot of better movies. Like, I was thinking of movies that had certain elements that this movie had, but they just did them better. Like, I was also thinking about the movie The Stepfather, which I watched for the first time last year, which I really, really enjoyed, and I actually did a review of in this channel. I'll link it in the description below. You know, that movie's similar because Terry O'Quinn is playing a character who's pretending to be somebody else, but really he's an evil person with his own motivations. And that's another movie where there is no real mystery. We know exactly up front who this guy is, but it works in that movie's benefit because the movie is under 90 minutes. It moves at a much faster pace, and there's no fat on that movie. It's very... It knows what it is. It's a lean movie, The Stepfather is, which I think this movie should have been that. This movie, there's really no reason why this movie should have been more than 90 minutes. Because like I said, none of the characters have any depth. It's all really generic stuff. So they should have just, you know, kept it as concise as possible and really doubled down on all the drama and tension. The other movie that this made me think of was Misery. Because in Misery, we find out that Annie is crazy, but we don't know the motivation as to why. And then we find out that revelation of like, oh, this is her backstory, and wow, this is really messed up. And I think this movie could have benefited from being a mystery. It would have kept me more engaged. But because I knew who Peyton was, I knew what type of character she was, you know, just waiting for this movie to get to the good stuff took forever, and it was all just horribly, horribly predictable. But it was an interesting movie. I don't regret watching this movie. I probably won't watch it again. I'm glad I watched this movie. I find these type of movies interesting, and I think I'll go more into the rabbit hole of these type of movies, because maybe I'll find one that really works for me. Like I said, maybe Cape Fear. Does Cape Fear count as a yuppie thriller? Does The Stepfather count as a yuppie thriller? Because I think those movies are great, and they kind of have similar qualities that these type of movies have. But yeah, I would love to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts on this movie? What are your favorite yuppie thrillers? I'm looking for recommendations, because most of these movies I haven't seen. So whatever your favorites are, list them in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.